When you look at human history, it's hard not to ask, why are we capable of such incredible cruelty? I mean, from massive wars to individual acts of terror, our story is just soaked in blood. So we're going to dive into that really tough question, and we'll be using Eric Fromm's incredible work to try and understand the anatomy of human destructiveness. Okay, so let's just get right to the heart of it, right? Are we born to kill? Is it just hardwired into our DNA? Is there some kind of violent instinct that we just can't shake? For a really long time, a super popular theory said, yeah, absolutely. And the main champion of this idea was the famous ethologist Konrad Lorenz. He was convinced that aggression is a fundamental, built-in instinct. You can see his words right here. He talks about militant enthusiasm, having a phylogenetically determined releasing mechanism. Okay, that's a mouthful, right? But it's basically a fancy, scientific way of saying it's this ancient, inherited trigger that's just baked into our biology, something we can't get rid of, only try to manage. So Lorenz's theory got this nickname, the hydraulic theory. And it's actually a pretty good way to picture it. Think about a giant dam, and behind it, water is just building up and up and up. The pressure keeps growing. Sooner or later, that water has to go somewhere, right? It has to be released. And that's how he saw aggression, as this spontaneous energy inside us that just builds and builds until it absolutely has to be discharged, one way or another. And to back this up, Lorenz actually used a pretty personal story about his aunt. It went like this. She'd hire a new maid, and at first, she was just over the moon, praising her constantly, saying she was the best ever, but then, slowly, she'd start to find these little faults. And those little faults would get bigger and bigger until, almost like clockwork, after about 8 to 10 months, bam, she'd just erupt in this huge, violent argument and fire the maid. And then, the whole cycle would just start all over again. For Lorenz, this was the perfect example. See? The aggressive energy built up until it just had to explode. But here's where Eric Fromm comes in. He looked at that exact same story and saw something totally different. He said, wait a minute, this has nothing to do with a biological instinct. For Fromm, this was all about character. He suggested the aunt was a deeply narcissistic person. See, she wasn't really hiring an employee. She was trying to find a perfectly devoted servant to live out some kind of fantasy. And when the real person, the maid, inevitably couldn't live up to that impossible fantasy, her narcissistic rage just blew up. So the key difference here, the problem wasn't in her biology, it was in her psychology. And really, this whole story about the aunt is a perfect window into Fromm's entire approach. He doesn't just say, hey, I have a different opinion. No, he systematically takes apart this whole instinct myth, piece by piece, with actual evidence. So let's take a look at how he does that.
Okay, first up, Fromm looks to the animal kingdom. And his logic is pretty simple. If aggression were this innate, built-in drive, you'd expect to see it everywhere, right? But we don't, not even close. Just look at this stark contrast. In captivity, like in a zoo, you get overcrowding, social structures are a mess, and animals like baboons become incredibly violent. I mean, 17.5 times more frequent in males. But then you look at those same animals in the wild, in their natural home, and they are remarkably peaceful. So what does that tell you? It suggests that this crazy aggression isn't some internal pressure cooker. It's a reaction to a sick, unnatural environment.
All right, so what about our own ancestors? The typical image is the brutish caveman with a club, right? Well, the actual anthropological evidence paints a completely different picture. It turns out that the most primitive societies, hunter-gatherers, were often the least violent. I mean, their entire survival depended on cooperation and sharing. There wasn't a lot of private property to fight over, and there was basically zero economic incentive for a big war. And get this, when conflicts did happen, they were often resolved in these amazing non-violent ways, like the Eskimo tradition of song duels. Seriously, opponents would just mock each other in songs until the crowd basically picked a winner. That does not sound like a species that's just born to kill, does it? Okay, so if aggression isn't this single, simple instinct that just builds up and explodes, then what is it? This is where Fromm's work gets really groundbreaking. He basically says, hold on, we're making a huge mistake. We're using one word, aggression, to talk about two fundamentally different things. First, you've got what he calls benign aggression. And this is basically the defensive kind. It's the impulse we share with pretty much all animals. If a threat pops up, you either fight back or you run. It's a direct reaction to danger, it helps you survive, and, this is the really important part, the second the threat is gone, the aggression stops. It's totally necessary for survival. But then, Then there's maligned aggression. And this is the really dark stuff we're talking about. This is cruelty, destructiveness, just for the sake of it, the desire to dominate and control others. And unlike that benign defensive aggression, this is not a reaction to a threat. It serves no biological purpose for survival, and you don't see it in animals. According to Fromm, this is a uniquely human problem, a uniquely human sickness. So if this malignant destructiveness isn't an inheritance from our animal past, then where in the world does it come from? Well, Fromm's answer is both fascinating and kind of terrifying. He says it comes from the very things that make us human in the first place.
Let's walk through this logic step by step. First, unlike pretty much every other animal, we're born with really weak instincts. Biologically speaking, we're the most helpless animal out there. Second, we have reason and self-awareness. We are aware of ourselves, of our powerlessness, and we're the only animal that is fully conscious of its own death. Now that awareness, that's number 3, it creates these incredibly deep existential needs. A need for meaning, for belonging, for some kind of map to make sense of the world. And that leads to the 4th and most critical step. If a person's life is so empty or blocked that they can't find healthy, creative ways to find meaning and purpose, a really dark, pathological alternative can pop up. Destruction itself becomes a twisted way to feel powerful, to feel alive, to make a dent in the universe and prove that you were here.
So here's the absolute core of the argument, the big takeaway. Our capacity for real malignant destructiveness, it's not some leftover animal instinct. It's a distorted pathological outcome of our most uniquely human qualities, the very things we're proud of. It's a sickness that can grow out of our reason, our imagination, and our self-awareness. And if that's true, if this is a human problem, rooted not in our biology, but in the conditions of our existence, well, that changes everything. It means it's not our fate. It means it demands a human solution. It means we actually have a choice in the matter. Fromm has this incredible quote that really sums it up. He says, "The world wasn't made for us. We're just thrown into it. It's only by our own activity, by our own reason, that we can create a world that's actually our home, a world that helps us grow and develop fully. In other words, we have to build the conditions that let us flourish. Because if we don't, we create the conditions where we just fester." And that leaves us with one last, really challenging question, doesn't it? If Fromm is right, if our destructiveness isn't our biological destiny, but is actually a product of the societies we build, then the blame isn't on our genes. The responsibility is on us. We have to look around and ask ourselves, what kind of society are we choosing to create, right here, right now? Is it a world that nurtures connection and meaning, or is it one that creates the kind of isolation and emptiness that becomes the breeding ground for destruction?